As we think toward the new year that we're facing and all that might be ahead of you, I mentioned just a little bit this morning about, each one of us have our calendars and things that are plugged in there. And of course, as you well know, besides some events that you may have already put in your 2013 calendar, there's going to be a lot of other things that are going to happen along the way that you weren't planning for. Some good, some bad. And in all those things, we're going to have to deal with that as Christians. Along the way also, there are going to be choices that we'll have opportunities to make. And you may have heard the old phrase, you make the choices and you pay your prices. And that's kind of what I want to talk about tonight. But in another sense of what we can gain an opportunity, making right choices and gaining great gain, making great gain. And so I choose 1 Corinthians 9 because it starts with the concept of Paul really defending his apostleship because of choices he made. In a good way, but he has to nonetheless still defend himself to this church at Corinth, which you'd think would be kind of ridiculous that the man of Paul's caliber, in response to God and who he was, that relationship that he had, why would he ever have to prove himself to any group of Christians? Just think of all the places he's been, the converts that he's made, the churches that he started, the sacrifices he's gone through, the persecutions he endured, the ability he had to raise people from the dead, and all these other miraculous gifts. I mean, why would Paul have to prove himself? But because of some choices that he decided to make and not to take advantage of, although he had the right to do, there were people in this church in Corinth that began to look down on his apostleship, or maybe even doubt if it was authentic. After all, he's not really one of the 12. He was some come-along that came later on in life. Now, couple that with the experiences that the Corinthian church particularly was going through. And if you've not read the letter, you may miss out on, but let me just fill you in just a tiny bit. In the fact that, for reasons that God chose, this church had a tremendous amount of miraculous gifts. Now, God used miracles in a variety of different ways in that day and time, but all of them for the main purpose, really, of communicating His message. Nowadays, we have the message in its entirety. There's no need to have a miracle to back it up because it's proof right here what God intends to say to us. But back then, they had some tremendous miracles. And of a lot of different churches that God chose through the laying on of apostles' hands to give miraculous gifts to some of these people to communicate His will, the Corinthian church had an abundance of that. Now, because of their great abundance of their miraculous gifts and all these people, and maybe it was a large church, it was in a rather astute area, Greek culture, you can imagine. And these people began to be rather proud about who they were and what they did, and now all of a sudden you start thinking about where they're coming from. You look at this old photo from Damascus named Saul, who changed his life to Paul, who never was part of the 12. You can see why they might start to come to think that he's not really even compared to us. And so here's where Corinthians starts in chapter 9. Paul says, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord?" That's one of the proofs of the apostleship. Not just to have seen Him, of course, but to have been with Him from the beginning of His ministry all the way through to His resurrection. Paul had a private study on that after his conversion. Then he says to them, the last part of verse 1, "Are you not my work in the Lord? And if I am not an apostle to others," like maybe somebody else might think that because they've never met me, "yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal," in other words, the proof of my apostleship in the Lord. So somewhere along the line, they've grown up after Paul's been there and feel like we don't need this guy anymore. We don't need to listen to him. Verse 3, my defense to those who examine me is this. Do we have no right to eat or to drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of our Lord, and Cephas, that is Peter? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Put a pause here for just a moment, because what Paul is talking about is there is a right or a privilege to receive money or payment for preaching the gospel. Paul also could have married and had along with him a wife, as some of the apostles did, and as mentioned here, even Peter himself and some of Jesus' brothers. But he didn't choose to do any of those things because he chose not to do it. He was free to do that, but he thought, for what I want to do and the places I want to go, it's going to be easier to travel alone. Or at best with Barnabas, maybe Timothy or Luke or whatever along the way, or a few others, but I'm not going to be worrying about keeping up with making sure my family is in order, as any husband ought to. So he didn't have that concern, but he's telling these people he had that right and chose not to do it. Now here's where we're getting down to here. He said, verse 7, whoever goes to war at his own expense, or who plants a vineyard and does not eat of the fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. Now do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same? And then he quotes an Old Testament passage about law of Moses not muzzling, saying not muzzle out the ox or treads out the corn. And the application they made was it was just to the oxen. Jesus says, no, or Paul says rather, there's a whole lot more to it. So as he talks in verse 11, he says, if we have some spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others, and here's the thing, somebody else out there was wedging their way in. If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? You see, not only were there some people that were using a right to receive from the gospel, but they were trying to push Paul out. Say, he's not anybody. He's not even taking any money. He's not a real apostle. The rest of the apostles, now there's somebody. They've got women with them, and they do this and that. And so here's Paul dealing with all of this. Verse 12. Back at it. If others are partakers of the right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Choices and prices. Now here, as Paul is talking about a choice that he made, he is doing it for a purpose in here. He is trying to reap something greater among the Corinthian church. He chose not to have a wife, although I'm sure there were times that he would have enjoyed some companionship out along that trail. Somebody to sit down and talk with him. Someone that he could just hold on to as husbands and wives have that opportunity and privilege. But he turned away from all of that in order to devote himself entirely to preaching the gospel. He had a right, and he gave it up at his choice, not for his own price that he's paying for being without something, as much as